On August 23, 1995, 31-year-old Donna Winger stepped out of the air-conditioned baggage claim exit of the St. Louis airport to look for the van that would take her back to her home in Springfield, Illinois. Next to Donna was a cart carrying all of her luggage. Slung over her forearm was the carrying handle of a child's car seat, and sleeping inside of it was Donna's 3-month-old daughter, Bailey. The 88-degree afternoon was warm, even for August, but not nearly as hot as it had just been in Florida, where Donna and Bailey had just spent the last few days visiting with Donna's dad, mom, stepdad, and 2 sisters. Now tanned and rested from her vacation, Donna couldn't wait to get home to tell her husband Mark about the trip. Feeling very tired, Donna suddenly felt totally relieved that her mother and stepfather had hired a private driver to take her and her daughter the rest of the way home. It was about a 2-hour drive from the airport to her single-story house just outside of the city, and with a private driver, she and her daughter could just sleep the whole time. A minute later, a 27-year-old, lanky, dark-haired man stepped out of a waiting van parked in the limo area and waved at Donna, holding up a handwritten sign that had her name on it. As Donna started to gather her bags, the driver smiled at her and hurried over to give her a hand. A few moments later, he had opened the hatch of the van and stowed the luggage in the trunk, while Donna carefully strapped Bailey and her car seat into the back seat of the van, and then she too climbed inside and buckled up as well. The man hopped into the driver's seat and checked his rear and side view mirrors, then pulled out into the stream of traffic headed for the airport exit. Even though all Donna wanted to do was just sleep, she figured she should wait to see if the driver was the type of person who wanted to make small talk, in which case she could indulge him for a few minutes and then go to sleep, and then she wouldn't be as rude. And sure enough, within seconds of starting the car, the driver wanted to chat. He introduced himself as Roger Harrington and said that he lived in the area. The man seemed nice enough, and for a few minutes they chatted about the weather in Springfield and how it was hotter than usual for August. Then Roger complimented Donna on her tan, to which she kind of laughed off and said she'd just spent the last few days sitting by a pool and probably was more sunburned than tanned. Eventually, Donna's responses got shorter and shorter as she was trying to give the man a hint that she just kind of wanted to be left alone. But he wasn't taking the hint. He just kept on asking her question after question, and eventually, the questions became very inappropriate. He started asking her about her sex life and whether she liked orgies and whether she wanted to come to one of his sex parties. All the while, he'd be looking into the rearview mirror to try to make eye contact with her. Donna felt totally creeped out and began tucking herself into the corner of her seat to try to get out of the view of his mirror. Finally, Donna just told Roger that she did not want to talk to him anymore, that her daughter was asleep and she didn't want their voices to wake her up, but Roger, again, did not take the hint. Instead, his questions and remarks got more and more sexually inappropriate and explicit, and his driving became faster and more erratic. And then he started talking about the voices he heard in his head, like the one belonging to an entity he called Dom that apparently told him to do bad things, and lately Dom had been telling Roger to hurt people. By the time Roger pulled onto Donna's street, Donna was panicking and just praying that he didn't try to hurt her or her child. And so when he pulled up in front of her house, Donna hopped out of the car, grabbed her daughter, and practically ran her into the house. And then she went back outside, and without even looking up at Roger, she just grabbed all of her things and then rushed back inside the house. With her front door shut and locked, Donna looked through the peephole of the door and watched with relief as Roger climbed into his van and drove off. At this point, Donna's husband, Mark, who was an average-sized guy with glasses and dark hair that had begun to thin, he had come into the room. He had been downstairs in their basement using their treadmill. And he was about to ask how the Florida trip went, but he could tell right away that his wife was very upset about something, and so he asked her, what's going on? It would take her a minute to compose herself, but Donna began explaining her car ride and how awful it had been and how she really had been in fear for her life. Mark listened attentively while he held their daughter Bailey, and even though he was calm and reassuring on the outside, inside he was furious. How dare this man put his wife and daughter in danger? So at some point toward the end of her explanation of what happened, Mark told Donna to just write down an account of exactly what happened on the drive so that they could use it later on if they decided to file a complaint. Donna agreed that that was a good idea, and so she stepped away and jotted some notes down on some paper, and then she stuck those notes to the refrigerator door with a magnet. Then, after that, even though both of them were still upset about the whole driver thing, they shifted their focus to their daughter, who was now rolling around on the ground, smiling and cooing. And before long, the couple was down there with her, laughing and goofing around. By the next morning, things in the Winger household seemed to be back to normal. Mark, a nuclear engineer for the state, was getting ready to go to work. Donna was still on maternity leave, so she and Bailey sat in the kitchen with Mark while he ate his breakfast. Married for 6 years, the only source of tension in the Winger household had been Donna's heartbreak years ago when she found out that she could not have children of her own. But the couple got over it, and Mark and Donna filled their lives with family and friends. They were as openly affectionate with each other as they had been when they first got married in 1986. They were very active in their synagogue and were part of its tightly knit Jewish community. The pair complemented each other beautifully. Mark was soft-spoken but had a great sense of humor, and Donna was outgoing with a smile that could light up the room. Everybody loved them. And in June of that year, just 3 months before Donna's trip to Florida, the couple got some amazing news. A teenage mother in the hospital where Donna worked as an operating room medical technician had just had a baby and wanted to place the infant for adoption. Donna and Mark immediately filed the paperwork, and a few days later, on a bright, warm day right outside of their house with family and neighbors looking on, Bailey was delivered into Donna's arms by a man from the adoption agency. Life was perfect. As Mark kissed Donna and Bailey goodbye that morning, Donna's awful encounter with Roger, the driver, had already faded from their memories. But that evening, she and her husband would be forced to talk about him again. That night, when Mark, Donna, and Bailey sat down for dinner, their phone rang. Mark got up to answer it, but when he picked up the receiver, all he heard was silence, and then a few seconds later, he heard a click as the caller hung up. Mark shrugged, hung up the phone himself, and then sat back down with his family, and then just a few minutes later, the phone rang again. Annoyed, Mark got up, answered it, and again, he heard silence, followed by a click. When Mark sat back down the second time, he felt totally unsettled. He couldn't help but think that the person who was calling them had to be Roger. The man had access to their home phone number because it was on their reservation paperwork that they knew he had, and Roger clearly had some serious issues and had shown a very unhealthy interest in Donna. And so as he was thinking about this as a potential possibility, Donna said to Mark, "I bet that was Roger." Even though the phone did not ring again that night, the Wingers remained on edge and triple-checked their locks that night before they went to bed. And then the next morning, when Mark got up, he immediately called Roger's employer, Bootheel Area Rapid Transportation Company, or BART for short, and he filed a formal complaint about how inappropriate Roger had been during the car ride with his wife and his daughter. Mark also told the company that he believed Roger was behind the 2 anonymous hang-up calls he received the night before. The company said they would look into it, and sure enough, later that day, they called Mark back to apologize for Roger's behavior during the car ride, and they told Mark that, as a result, they had given Roger a 6-month suspension. Mark thanked them and felt like justice had been done. He figured if Roger had been behind those hang-up calls too, that perhaps now he would stop, because he would know that Mark and Donna were prepared to take action against him. But the calls didn't stop. For the next several days, the phone in the Winger household rang constantly, and each time there was just silence and then a click. Finally, on the morning of August 29th, so 6 days after Donna and Bailey had returned from Florida, Mark had had enough. He pulled out the paperwork Donna had been given by Roger when she first got in the car with him, and on it was Roger's phone number. Mark dialed the number, and when Roger said hello, Mark very angrily said, "If you don't stop harassing my family with these phone calls, we are going to call the police." And then before Roger could answer, Mark just hung up on him. Confronting Roger directly had been cathartic for Mark. However, deep down, he knew his threat was unlikely to change Roger's behavior. Roger was obviously mentally unwell, and on top of that, he was likely very angry at the Wingers because their complaint had just gotten him suspended. And so these calls, which the police could do almost nothing about, were most likely Roger's way of getting some payback. But Mark figured, all he can do now is just wait and see what happens next. Later that day, just before 4 p.m., Mark was in the basement working out on the family's treadmill when he suddenly heard a thumping sound coming from upstairs. He turned off the treadmill and listened, and he heard it again, more thumping. And so he climbed off the treadmill and quickly walked over to the stairs and went up to the main floor. And when he got up there, he didn't see anything unusual on the floor, so he just walked straight to the master bedroom where Donna and Bailey had last been. But when he looked in the bedroom, Mark was immediately concerned. Bailey was in the middle of the bed, and Donna was not in the room. Donna would never just leave Bailey alone in a place where she could potentially get hurt, like by falling off of the bed. And so Mark knew something was up, and those thumping sounds could not be good. But before he could make sense of what was going on, Mark heard more thumping coming from somewhere on the other side of the house. Mark had a terrible feeling, so he rushed over to Bailey and he put big pillows all around her to keep her from rolling off of the bed. And then he rushed to his bedside table and he pulled out of one of the drawers a pistol that he kept there for protection. Then Mark slowly crept out of the bedroom with the gun at the ready. He shut the bedroom door behind him, and then he turned right and started walking down the hallway toward the dining room, which is where he believed the thumping sounds were coming from. And so as he walked, his heart rate began to spike. He had no idea what was making these sounds or what he was going to see when he reached the end of this hallway. And so finally, he gets to the end of the hallway, but he's still in the hallway, so he can't see what's in the dining room. And so he has his gun at the ready and he takes a deep breath, and then in one fluid motion, he steps into the dining room and turns right and gets a full view of the room to see what's going on in there. And what he sees is beyond horrible. His wife, Donna, is on her knees in the middle of the dining room, and standing behind her is a man Mark has never seen before. And the man is holding a hammer, and he's raising it above his head, and then he brings it down and he smashes it into the back of Donna's skull. There was blood all over the walls. Mark started screaming, and then Donna, she turned and looked at her husband, and then Mark had to watch as this guy raised the hammer again and hit her as hard as he could across the base of her skull, sending her crumpling onto the ground. Mark reflexively raised his gun, pointed it at his wife's attacker, and he fired 2 shots, both hitting the man in the head. The man dropped the hammer, and then he fell backward onto the floor and was motionless. And so, shaking violently from adrenaline and shock, Mark ran to his wife, who's face down in a growing pool of blood, and he put his gun down on the side, and then he grabbed his wife and tried to roll her over to try to help her. But as he did, he heard the sound of this attacker starting to move around, and so without enough time to grab his gun, Mark just turned around and grabbed the hammer that was on the ground between him and this man, and he wound up and he smashed the attacker as hard as he could right in the center of his chest. And when he did, the attacker groaned and went silent. Then Mark chucked the hammer out of reach of the attacker, and he turned his attention back to his wife, who was now unresponsive. In an absolute panic, Mark ran for the phone and he called 911. When the police and paramedics arrived, they rushed inside the house and they found Mark crouched over his wife, who was barely conscious, and he's sobbing over her, and her attacker was only a few feet away. He was lying on his back, and amazingly, he was still alive. He was groaning, even though his head had been destroyed from those 2 gunshot wounds. The police very quickly took 3 pictures in rapid succession of the positioning of Donna and her attacker's bodies, where they were on the ground. Basically, they needed a snapshot of exactly what the crime scene looked like as soon as they arrived. And then the police pulled Mark aside to talk to him, while the medics rushed inside and put Donna and her attacker on stretchers, and then they loaded them into an ambulance that was waiting outside, and they rushed them to the hospital. Right before the ambulance left, one of the police detectives, Charlie Cox, he pulled a wallet out of the back pocket of the attacker. And inside the wallet, Detective Cox found a driver's license, and it belonged to 27-year-old Roger Harrington. Sitting inside the bedroom he shared with his wife, Mark sat on the edge of the bed staring off into space while asking over and over again if his wife was going to be okay. At first, the police really weren't saying much since they knew Mark was in shock. But eventually, Detective Cox asked Mark if he had recognized his wife's attacker. Mark said no, but then he looked up suddenly, his eyes seeming to focus for the first time, and he said to the detective, "It has to be Roger Harrington." After explaining why he thought that, Detective Cox would tell him that yes, it was Roger. As it dawned on Mark that Roger's attack might well have been triggered by the complaint he filed, as well as the phone confrontation he had with him, Mark broke down completely and just began sobbing hysterically. Meanwhile, Roger Harrington would die on his way to the hospital. As for Donna, she would die too, just 40 minutes after arriving at the emergency room. It turned out that Roger Harrington was already known to area police. He had been a psychiatric patient at a local treatment facility. Although he did not have a criminal history, Detective Cox himself had once had to respond to a domestic dispute between Roger and his then wife. And in addition to Mark's report of the harassing phone calls and his complaint to Roger's employer, the detectives had also discovered Donna's handwritten note on the fridge that detailed exactly what this guy had done in the car ride with her just 6 days earlier. It all added up to a tragic pattern of obsession and violence. Losing his job had apparently been the last straw. Roger Harrington had snapped. And now Donna Winger was dead. Her baby was again motherless, and Mark's life was shattered. Over the next several months, Donna's family would all take turns flying from Florida to Springfield to help Mark take care of Bailey while he tried to put his life back together. Not only was the extended family devastated by their own loss, they were also horrified by what Mark must have gone through, what he had seen, and what he had been forced to do. And it was obviously taking a toll on him because he had begun drinking heavily. Finally, Donna's mother just stepped in and told Mark, look, you really need to go out and hire a nanny who can come in and live with you guys and take care of Bailey, kind of help you get back on your feet again. And so with the encouragement and assistance of Donna's mother, Mark Wood put an ad out for a live-in nanny. And at the start of 1996, he hired 23-year-old Rebecca Simic, a recent college graduate who had always wanted to work with children and who felt sure she could help fix this broken family. About 4 months later, Donna's mother was hurt, but not totally surprised, when Mark called her to say that Rebecca was pregnant. But Donna's family really liked Rebecca. She was not only amazing with Bailey and with Mark, but she also was just very respectful of the situation she was in. And in many ways, she represented a way forward for Mark and for Bailey, and so Donna's family gave the couple their blessing. And at the end of the year, Mark and Rebecca eloped to Hawaii for a quiet wedding ceremony, and then over the next 4 years, Mark and Rebecca went on to have 3 children of their own. They also left the house where Donna was killed and moved to a larger house in the country with room enough for their growing family. Eventually, Mark withdrew both from Donna's family and from the tight-knit Jewish community that had been such a big part and reminder of his life with Donna. He also lost touch with their rabbi and converted to Christianity. But despite these changes, Mark never forgot about Donna. Even though the investigation into her death was officially closed, Mark periodically would stop in to the Springfield police station to ask them if they had learned anything new about Roger Harrington's motivation for this crime. Mark knew that Roger was unhinged, but the attack just seemed so random. Roger had only met Donna a few days earlier. What could possibly drive him to kill her so quickly? Even though her attacker was dead, Mark felt determined to see to it that someone be held accountable for Donna's death. And so Mark filed a lawsuit against BART, the transportation company that had employed Roger. Mark claimed that BART was negligent in hiring Roger, and they should have known that he was dangerous. With millions of dollars in potential damages at stake, BART attorneys began their own investigation into the circumstances around Donna's death. But years would go by and the lawsuit just kind of dragged on quietly and no new developments were discovered. But all that would change in 1999. In February of that year, the Springfield police got a call from a local woman who made an outlandish claim. She said there was another person besides Roger Harrington that was involved in Donna's murder, and she gave the police their name. Now, police get lots of tips, and many of them are not useful or not true. But the detective who received this tip had been directly involved in investigating Donna's murder back in 1995, and he had always kind of had his doubts about the way the crime scene was interpreted at the time. And so after getting this tip from this woman, the detective decided to review some of the evidence from Donna's case, and very quickly he noticed a discrepancy. Those 3 pictures that were taken by police right when they arrived on scene that showed in the same picture Donna and Roger, well, those pictures had just been slipped into the case file as an afterthought, and until that moment, no one had really looked at them closely. But now, thinking about the possibility of another person being involved in this murder, these 3 pictures took on a whole new meaning to this detective. These photos, along with the tip from this woman and later combined with evidence unearthed by BART's investigators, would reopen the Donna Winger case. And eventually, after another 2 years of painstaking interviews and forensic examination, the police learned that there really was another person involved in Donna's murder, and there was much more to the story than they had originally thought. This is the full story of what happened to Donna Winger. At about 3:45 p.m. on August 29, 1995, so the day Donna died, Mark was in the basement on the treadmill when he heard a thumping sound coming from upstairs. After turning the treadmill off, he listened and heard the thumping again, and so he quickly walked over to the stairs and began heading up to the main floor. When he got up there, he looked around and he didn't see anyone or anything strange, but instead of going to the master bedroom to check on his wife and daughter like he had told police, Mark walked to the front door. The thumping he had heard downstairs was just the sound of someone knocking on the door. When he looked through the peephole of the front door, he saw a man in his mid-20s standing there. Mark opened the door, and then this young man introduced himself as Roger Harrington. Mark said hello and gestured for Roger to come inside of the house. Roger did and walked straight to the nearest table, which was in the dining room, and when he got there, he placed his cigarettes down on top of it as well as his travel cup that contained some coffee, and then Roger turned around to face Mark. And when he did, he saw Mark was now holding a pistol out in front of him. Roger was so shocked he just froze and stood there, not saying or doing anything, and then Mark ordered Roger to turn around and get on his knees. And once Roger did this, Mark simply raised his gun and fired a single shot into the back of Roger's head. Hearing the gunshot, Donna, who was in the master bedroom with their daughter Bailey, she came running out to see what was going on, and when she got to the dining room where Roger was on the ground in this pool of blood, she saw him and had no idea what to make of it and just started crying and shaking and looking around wildly, wondering what was happening. And as she stood there, her husband, Mark, snuck up behind her with a hammer in his hand. His first blow struck her on the left side of her head. She never saw it coming. And then as she stumbled, she turned and tried to put her arms up over her head to protect herself, but it wasn't enough. Mark bludgeoned her skull over and over and over again while she screamed at him to stop. Eventually, after the seventh blow to her head, Donna crumpled onto the ground next to Roger. Once he was sure his wife was down for good, Mark picked up the phone and placed a hysterical call to 911. In the background, barely audible, you can hear a groan. It was Roger. At that point, Mark abruptly ends the call with the dispatcher saying his baby is crying and he has to go take care of her. But in reality, after he hung up the phone, Mark walked over to Roger, then just fired another shot into his head, this one going straight through his forehead. Then Mark picked up the bloody hammer and struck Roger one time as hard as he could in the chest. Mark knew the police would find his prints all over the hammer, so he needed a story for why that was. He would later tell police that as he tended to his wife, he thought he heard Roger moving toward them, at which point he didn't have time to grab his gun, and so he turned around and he grabbed the hammer that was on the ground, and he hit him that one time. With his wife's blood streaking his face and arms and soaking into his t-shirt, Mark attempted to rearrange the two bodies to make it look like Roger had been attacking Donna from behind when he was shot down. Then, right as he got the bodies basically the way he wanted them, he heard the sirens fast approaching, and so he got himself into position. When the police and medics rushed inside the house, they found Mark sobbing over his wife's nearly lifeless body. Mark had actually done a fairly good job of framing Roger for this murder. However, he had made a critical mistake, and those 3 photographs the police took of Roger and Donna's bodies right when they arrived on scene proved it. In those pictures, you can see that Roger is lying at an angle that was inconsistent with Mark's description of what happened. Basically, the way Roger's body was found, it would not have been possible for him to have been attacking Donna at the time he was shot, which meant Mark's story was a lie. It would turn out this whole murder had just been a crime of opportunity. The tipster who had called the police and suggested that another person had been involved in Donna's death was a woman named Deanne Schultz, and Deanne told them that she was Donna's best friend and that Donna's husband, Mark, was her killer. Deanne said she knew this because she had actually had an affair with Mark shortly before Donna's death, and apparently it had been a very intense relationship where they had exchanged wedding bands and vowed to be together, and during this affair, Mark had started telling Deanne that life would be so much better for the two of them that they could finally be together for good if Donna just died. Deanne did not think he was serious and so never thought much of it, But it would turn out Mark was very serious. He just needed to figure out a way to kill his wife without getting caught. And so when Donna came home from Florida and talked about how inappropriate her driver Roger had been and how he had seemed totally crazy and dangerous, Mark realized he had found the perfect fall guy. He started framing Roger by complaining about him to his company and getting him suspended. And then as for those anonymous hang-up calls, the only person who ever answered the phone for them was Mark, and so most likely he fabricated those. Deanne said Mark believed if he could just find a way to get Roger to come inside of his house when Donna was home, Mark could pull this murder off. Investigators tracked down phone records that showed that Mark Winger had called Roger Harrington on the morning of Donna's death, August 29th. Roger's family corroborated that Roger had received a call from Mark that day, and that Mark had apparently asked Roger to come over to his house so they could resolve the complaint Mark had placed against him. And since Roger desperately needed his job back, he happily agreed to go, not realizing that Mark was luring him to his death. Deanne claimed that at the time, despite how specifically Mark was talking about this frame job, she still was not taking him seriously, which is why she didn't go to police about this. But after Donna's murder, Deanne knew Mark had done it. However, Mark had told her that she could never go to police because she knew too much, and if he went down, she would too. So she had stayed quiet and eventually broken up with Mark and moved on with her life. But 4 years after the murder, her conscience got the best of her, and so she contacted police. Deanne would receive immunity for her testimony. On June 5, 2002, after a 3-week-long public trial in which he declared his innocence, Mark Winger was found guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Immediately after Mark's conviction, his second wife, Rebecca, divorced him and changed her last name back to Simic. She packed Bailey and her other 3 children into her brother's car, and she relocated to Louisville, Kentucky. As of today, all 4 of the Simic children have grown into successful adults who have built careers in teaching, art, and business. On a snowy morning in 1972, 22-year-old Sotria Kritsonis sat at her bus stop in Seattle, Washington, adjusting her knit cap against the cold. The hat actually still felt pretty weird on her head because just a few days earlier, she had cut her brown hair super short, and so she wasn't quite used to it yet. But despite that, she loved her new hair. In fact, she couldn't wait to show it off at her school. She'd deliberately worn this big hat to hide her haircut, because this would make the reveal to her friends at school that much better. She glanced up Rainer Avenue for any sign of her bus, but there wasn't one. The city's public transportation system was all out of whack that day because of the weather, and so Tria was becoming pretty impatient because now her bus was over an hour late. She'd already missed her first class of the day because of this bus, and now she was in danger of missing her second class. And that's when she heard the beep of a car horn, and a pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle rolled up to the curb right in front of her. So Tria had to squint through the snow, but she could see the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat of this car, and he was rolling down the window of the passenger side and kind of waving her over. Curious, she walked up to the now open window and leaned in, and the warmth coming from inside the car felt great. And this is where Sotria got her first real look at the driver. He was a good-looking guy in his 20s, he was well-dressed, pleasant-seeming, just an overall normal-looking person. He explained that he'd actually been driving on Rainer Ave for a while, and he hadn't seen a bus in a long time, and so he offered to give Sotria a ride to her school. But remember, this is the 1970s, and hitchhiking at the time in America was pretty common, especially on the West Coast where Sotria was. And so pretty quickly, she agreed to get in because she knew this likely was her best chance at making it to school for her second class, and she was freezing. After the man pulled back onto Rainer Avenue, Sotria sat back in the seat, enjoying the warm air blasting out of the vents. And as she did, she looked out her window at the familiar route passing by. Sotria was about to apologize to this guy for making him drive so far out of his way when she heard him turn on his blinker. He was preparing to turn right. And this struck Sotria as odd because, as she had explained to him back on the curb, her school was a straight shot down Rainer Ave. There was no need to turn, so what was he doing? Sotria looked over at the man, expecting him to explain why they were taking this sudden detour, but the man just stared straight ahead. And then a moment later, she heard the blinker turned on again, and she looked up and saw they were about to merge onto Interstate 5 southbound, which was definitely not the way to Sotria's school. And now Sotria felt a pang of fear. She opened her mouth to tell this guy he was going the wrong way, but he cut her off. And he looked at her and he said, it's a terrible idea to take a ride from a stranger. The man kept on talking as he merged onto the highway, but Sotria was not listening at all. Instead, she was fixated on what he was doing with his right hand. His left hand was on the wheel, but with his right hand, he was fishing for something underneath his seat. And so Sotria's mind began to race. Without taking her eyes off of this man and what he was doing, she traced with her hand and felt for the door handle, but she couldn't feel it. And then she turned and realized there was no door handle. It had been removed. Just then, the man stopped rummaging around underneath his seat. Whatever he was looking for, he had found it. The man sat partway up and looked at Sotria with his hand still hidden behind one of his legs and a determined but emotionless expression on his face. At this point, Sotria felt her heart hammering so hard in her chest that she was worried she might pass out from terror. All she could think about was, what is he hiding behind his leg? What was underneath his seat? But then, something strange happened. The man's face changed from determined and almost cruel to confused. Sotria watched as his eyes darted up to the top of her head. The man told Sotria to take off her hat, and with trembling hands, she did as she was instructed, although she had no idea why he was asking. And when the hat was off her head, the man looked shocked, and he dropped whatever it was he had found back under his seat, and Sotria heard it land with a heavy metallic thud, but she couldn't see it. There was a long, tense silence, and then when the man finally spoke, he just said, "Why did you cut your hair?" The man immediately got off the highway and drove fast to Sotria's school. When they got there, he opened up the door for her and told Sotria to get out and said she was lucky. Then he drove away. Sotria didn't report this encounter to police. She was kind of embarrassed that she had gotten into a stranger's car in the first place, and after all, the guy, despite being really creepy, hadn't hurt her at all, and so she basically just tried to forget about it. But a few years later, in 1975, Sotria was watching TV when she saw a familiar face come onto the screen. It was the man who had given her a ride, being led into a courtroom in handcuffs. Sotria dropped everything and turned up the volume, and what she heard made her numb with horror. Because the newscaster was saying that this man who had given her a ride was a suspected serial killer accused of murdering dozens of young women who he would lure into his pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle and then bludgeon them to death with a crowbar or tire iron. And he had a very specific type when it came to identifying his victims. They were young women who all had long brown hair. And this man's name was Ted Bundy. Our next story is called The Box. Late one afternoon in April of 2019, a middle-aged woman named Mary was cutting up some vegetables in her kitchen in northern Spain when she heard a knock on her front door. So she put her things down, she went to the door, opened it up, and standing there was her next-door neighbor, who was all smiles, and she was holding this big box that was wrapped in wrapping paper and had a big bow on it, and then sitting on top of this big gift was a tray of deep-fried rolls, or croquettes. Mary's neighbor was a 61-year-old woman named Carmen Marino, who was an exceptional chef, and her specialty were making these croquettes. They were filled with different types of meat and other things, and all the time, Carmen would come over and give them to Mary, and Mary loved these croquettes. And so as soon as she saw those, she was like, wow, amazing, and she invited Carmen inside. But Carmen didn't come inside. Instead, she took the croquettes and handed them to Mary, and Mary's like, okay, great, thank you. But Carmen was still standing right outside holding this box, and now Mary's looking at her thinking that Carmen looks kind of uneasy. And so Mary said, what's going on here? What's up with this box? Carmen was silent for a second and just kind of held this box out, at which point Mary realized, okay, so she's trying to give me this gift. And so Mary reached out and took this huge present, and she was like, "Thank you, Carmen. Like, what is this? What's going on?" And Mary, when she looked at Carmen, she could tell Carmen's face was now bright red. She was very embarrassed about something, maybe whatever she was going to say, and so Mary just waited for Carmen to speak. And so eventually she would clear her voice, and then she would say, "Mary, this is really embarrassing, but I need you to hold on to this box for a little bit. It contains my sex toys, and I'm having company over at my house, and I'm just worried that somehow they're going to find these things." Mary was so caught off guard by what Carmen was telling her that she just started laughing. But Carmen didn't join in on the laughter. She just kind of looked down like she was totally mortified. Mary stopped laughing because she felt bad, and then Carmen kind of elaborated on why she had this huge box full of sex toys. She would tell Mary that, she bought them with the intent of using them with her boyfriend, but a couple of months ago he had broken up with her. But Carmen had held on to these in the hopes that the boyfriend would eventually take her back and they would get back together again and get to use these toys. And so even though this was a totally weird and kind of uncomfortable request, Mary kind of felt bad for Carmen. One, because she had to make this request of Mary, but also two, it was obvious that Carmen was pretty shaken up about, losing her boyfriend. And so Mary said, "You know what? No problem, Carmen. I will look after your sex toys and I will enjoy your croquettes." And Carmen was so relieved and said, "Thank you so much." And then she turned and hustled back to her house. And then Mary shut the door and she brought the croquettes into the kitchen and she tried one and it was so good. And then she took the big box of sex toys and she went into the hallway. She opened up a closet and she put it on the top shelf and then shut the door. Over the next couple of days, Mary expected Carmen to come back over and reclaim her box of sex toys. But Carmen didn't. And when days turned into weeks and then turned into months, and still Carmen had not come over to get the sex toys, Mary was kind of annoyed, but she was just too embarrassed to go over to Carmen and be like, "Hey, why don't you come over and get your sex toys?" And so Mary just decided she would leave it alone and not talk about it, and if ever Carmen wanted them back, she could have them. But if she never asked for them again, Mary didn't care. She would just eventually throw the box away, and that would be it. A few months later, on September 29th, 2019, so we're talking about 6 months or so from when the sex toys were first brought over to Mary's house. Well, on this day, Mary was kind of doing chores in her house when she began to smell a really bad smell coming from the hallway closet where the box of sex toys were. And so Mary opened up the closet, and for sure, she could tell the bad smell was coming from this closet. And so she started by smelling the shoes that were towards the bottom of the closet to see if maybe she had stepped in something gross, but they were all clean. And then eventually she reached the sex toy box. She pulled it down from the top shelf, and it had never been opened. It's still wrapped, but she just smelled the box and she immediately recoiled because that had to be where the terrible smell was coming from. It was coming from this box. And so Mary was totally repulsed at the idea that these sex toys smell horrible. But she carried the box into the kitchen and set it down, and she thought, is this a horrible betrayal of my friend's trust if I open up this box and look at her sex toys? But Mary ultimately was like, "You know what? Carmen has not come back for this thing. I'm opening this up because I need to know what's making this smell." So Mary went over and got a pair of scissors and she cut off the wrapping paper, and then she opened up the box, and inside was like this big thing that had been wrapped in tinfoil. So all you saw was tinfoil. And so Mary, she reached down and kind of began to peel back the tinfoil. It was kind of sticking to whatever was under it. But eventually, after she kind of yanked on it, she pulled the tinfoil off. And when she saw what was in there, she began screaming and ran outside and called the police. It would turn out Mary's neighbor, Carmen, who owned the box of sex toys, well, her boyfriend didn't just break up with her a couple of months before she brought the sex toys over. No, her boyfriend, who was a 67-year-old man named Jesus Baranda, he went missing around the time that supposedly Carmen and her boyfriend broke up. And so naturally, Jesus's family began looking for Jesus, and when they couldn't find him, they called the police. And eventually the police called Carmen and said, "Hey, you were dating Jesus around the time he went missing. We're going to need to come to your house and search it." And when Carmen heard that, she knew she had a big problem. Because Carmen had murdered Jesus and cut his head off with a chainsaw, and she still had his head in her house. And so what did she do? Well, she boiled his head down, and then she put it in a box, wrapped it in tinfoil, and then she wrapped that box in wrapping paper, put a bow on it, and then went next door to Mary's house and said, "Hey, can you hold my sex toys for me?" Because she knew Mary would likely not look in the box if it was sex toys. And so Mary took the box, put it in her closet, and then of course, the smell began several months later, and she would discover Jesus's head. Carmen was convicted of murdering her boyfriend, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Police were never able to locate the rest of Jesus. All they had was his head. But there's a running theory that Carmen may have used the rest of her boyfriend's body and ground it up and then baked him into her croquettes that she gave out to people like Mary and other people in her neighborhood. But that's just a theory. The next and final story of today's episode is called, What's That Smell? On the evening of June 7th, 2023, a 36-year-old man named Umar Abdullah walked into his bedroom in Tampa Bay, Florida, and right away he opened up all the windows. Now, keep in mind, Tampa Bay, Florida is really hot. And so by doing this, he was letting in all this really hot air, but Umar did not care. He just wanted whatever was inside of his apartment out. Umar, along with his wife Samira and their 10-month-old daughter, had just gotten back to their apartment after a trip to Ohio, and the second they walked inside, they had smelled this weird smell. And it was something they had never smelled before. This was not like rotten food or anything like that. This was like a chemical smell. But even that wasn't a good description. It was like a cross between chemicals and maybe paint. And so at first, Umar and Samira just walked around their apartment, predominantly in the kitchen, looking for things that could be leaking, in the fridge or in cupboards or whatever, but they couldn't find anything that seemed like it could be the cause of the smell. And it was around this point, when they were totally stumped, that Umar and Samira remembered that their apartment building was extremely well taken care of. Like, repairs were done immediately and all the time in every single unit, and the fact that they had been away in Ohio had been known to their apartment manager, and so they thought, maybe while they were gone, maybe somebody had come in here and maybe touched up some paint or made some repairs or something, even though it seemed a bit weird that they hadn't been informed beforehand that, painting or repairs were going to take place in their apartment, but ultimately that's what they chalked it up to. And so it was at this point that Umar and Samira walked all around the apartment, opening up all the windows, and Samira also lit a candle as well, and pretty soon that weird smell disappeared, and both the parents just kind of forgot about it. And so Umar grabbed all their luggage from their trip and began unpacking it into the drawers and putting toiletries away, and at the same time, Samira put their baby in a high chair in the kitchen, and then Samira began preparing dinner. And a few minutes later, as Umar was still putting things away, he heard Samira calling from the kitchen to, "Hey, come out here for a second." And so Umar stopped what he was doing, he went into the kitchen, and he looked at Samira, and she was looking very concerned down at their daughter. And their daughter was in her high chair, and her dinner was right in front of her, but she wasn't eating. And their daughter seemed really fussy. And normally, their daughter was such a get-along kid who never fussed, who always ate her food, and so this seemed really out of character. And so both parents kind of stared at the daughter for a second, and then Umar was like, "You know what? All the windows are still open, and it's getting pretty hot in here. Maybe the baby's just fussy about the heat." And so Samira agreed that could totally be it, and so the parents went around the apartment, closing down all the windows, allowing the air conditioning to kick back on and cool the apartment down. But about an hour later, after the apartment had cooled back down, the baby was still very fussy. And at this point, Umar and Samira were trying to put the baby to bed, and they were really struggling with that. And also, in addition to the baby obviously not feeling very well, Umar and Samira both began to complain that they had headaches. And so at this point, the parents assumed that, all of this, the baby's behavior and now our headaches must be tied to just the travel we just went through, and we just need a day to recover here. And so they kind of rushed their baby through her bedtime routine and eventually got her down. And then Umar and Samira took some ibuprofen to help with their headaches. And then they too climbed in bed and drifted off to sleep, hoping that when they woke up, everybody would feel better again. But the next morning, nobody was better. In fact, everybody was doing worse. Umar's headache had now gotten much stronger, and Samira, she still had a headache, but also was very lethargic, and the baby was still very fussy. And over the next few days, their symptoms continued to get worse and worse. Umar's headache went from really bad to pretty much blinding, like he couldn't do anything else but think about his headache. And Samira basically had to lay down all day. It was like no matter how much she slept, she had zero energy, and their poor baby just continued to cry and fuss all the time, and even began to vomit. And so it seemed pretty obvious by this point, after a few days, that the three of them must have caught some sort of bug while they were traveling, that this was not just jet lag, that they actually had some sort of illness. But the parents were convinced that, they could just kind of rough it out, and eventually, after a couple of days, they would get better. But on the morning of June 14th, so this is now a week after coming back home from their trip, not only were all their symptoms still really bad, but on this particular morning, things took a dark turn. That morning, when Umar went to his daughter's bedroom, he's still dealing with this horrible headache, he makes his way into the bedroom, and he goes down to pick his daughter up from her crib, and as he's reaching down to grab her, he freezes. Because on the bed, on the pillow right behind the baby, is all the baby's hair. The baby had clearly lost huge chunks of her hair. And so Umar at this point forgot about his headache and yelled for Samira, and even though she's super lethargic, she could tell this is an emergency, so she got up and made her way into the bedroom, and she looked down too and saw all the hair, and she reached down and scooped the baby up, and she turned the baby over, and sure enough, there was a huge bald spot on the back of their baby's head. But Umar and Samira, they said to each other right away that, wait a minute, I know this is scary, but it is actually a thing that newborn babies sometimes do lose their hair. But when they went online and looked at the age range of when that's kind of a common thing to happen, it was pretty obvious that their baby, being 10 months old, was a little bit too old for losing her hair to be considered a normal thing. And so Umar and Samira sat there and continued Googling, what could this be? My 10-month-old baby is losing her hair. And there were lots of explanations ranging from, ringworm to some severe infection to some rare genetic disorder. And all of it was kind of terrifying. And also none of it really lined up with what they were seeing with their daughter. And so the parents were like, you know what? Clearly, we don't know what this is. We've all been sick for a week. We have to bring our baby to the doctor. And so as Samira got on the phone and called the baby's doctor, Umar hopped in the shower to get ready to go to the doctor. And as soon as he began shampooing his hair, he noticed clumps of his hair were falling out. And so all of a sudden it dawned on him that whatever's going on with his baby is going on with him and very likely going on with his wife too. And it was at this point too that Umar remembered that strange smell when they first walked into their apartment after coming back from their trip. Now, they had opened up all the windows and lit candles and, the smell had kind of dissipated, and then they had shut the windows again and they hadn't smelled it again. And so Umar began thinking, wait a minute, maybe we've just gone nose blind to the smell and maybe there's some sort of contamination in the air. Maybe there's a gas leak or something worse than that. And so as soon as Umar got out of the shower and told his wife about how he lost hair and kind of his theory that maybe there was some contamination in their apartment, Umar called his landlord and explained, the whole situation. And the landlord would tell Umar right off the top that, during the time they were in Ohio, nobody went inside their apartment. So there's no fresh paint in there, no maintenance was done. So whatever you smelled was not from us. And then the landlord said to Umar that, as scary as it sounds, it's possible that you might have like a gas leak inside of your apartment, or maybe you have a freon leak from your air conditioning system, or maybe there's toxic mold. But whatever it is, we're going to get people in there, we're going to find the issue and solve it. And so later that day, sure enough, a gas inspector showed up to Umar and Samira's apartment, and they checked the entire place, and they could not find any trace of a gas leak. They checked everywhere. There was no leak, but they did tell Umar and Samira that yes, we can smell a faint trace of some chemical smell, but we don't think it's gas. And then after the gas inspector left, the landlord went out and found a mold inspector who came into Umar and Samira's apartment. They looked everywhere and could not find any mold. Then the landlord brought in a plumber to check the hot water heater, but no issues with that. Then the landlord brought an HVAC company in, and they checked the air conditioning units, and there was no leak. And so finally, after the landlord had kind of run out of ideas for who to bring over to check the apartment, because again, by this point, nobody had found anything wrong with the apartment, Umar just said, you know what, I'm going to call the fire department. And so Umar, he calls the fire department, and the fire department, they send over their hazardous materials team or their hazmat team. And so they go into the apartment and they look everywhere, and there is nothing. They could not find any source that was causing the smell at all. It seemed very much like their apartment was totally safe and fine. But by this point, it's now been 2 weeks since Umar, Samira, and their baby had come back from that trip, and they still felt totally horrible. Umar still had his headaches, he was still losing his hair. Samira had begun losing her hair as well. She still had her headaches, she still felt lethargic, and their baby was still losing her hair, and she still was fussy and miserable. And all three of them now had developed this weird shortness of breath where they'd just be walking through the apartment, and suddenly it was like they couldn't even breathe. And so now they've had all these people who can't find anything wrong with their apartment. They'd gone to their doctors, and the doctors had no idea what was wrong with them. And so it was kind of like they had no idea what to do, but clearly this crisis was only getting worse and worse and worse. And so Umar felt like he had no more options. He couldn't leave his apartment. He couldn't afford to do that. And so they were just stuck in this place that seemed toxic. But all that would change on June 25th, so 2.5 weeks after they came home from that trip, because on this day, Umar discovered something about that chemical smell they caught right when they came back in after the trip. You know, the smell that all the people that had come into the apartment had sort of noticed but couldn't identify. On June 25th, Umar figured something out about that smell. And so on this day, Umar was in his apartment feeling completely miserable, as was his wife and his daughter who were in the bedroom. But at some point, Umar suddenly caught a whiff of that weird chemical smell. And as soon as he smelled it, he sort of began to cough, and he was about to call his landlord and be like, "Hey, I smelled it again." But he decided on this day, instead of calling anybody else, he was going to run an experiment of his own. And so instead of trying to get away from the smell, Umar began smelling in the air as deep as he could to try to kind of figure out where the smell was coming from. And so he began walking around his apartment, sniffing the air, kind of tracing the smell, and slowly but surely he began kind of following the smell through his kitchen, down the hallway, all the way to his front door. And when he got to his front door, he smelled in again, and he could tell the smell was the strongest right now. And so feeling a sudden jolt of adrenaline, he grabbed the door, flung it open, half expecting to see like a chemical cloud floating in the air in the hallway. But as soon as he opened the door, there was nothing outside. And when he smelled in the hallway, the smell wasn't really there anymore. And so he kind of looked around for a second, feeling kind of silly, and then he shut the door, and he was about to just go back into his apartment and just kind of accept that once again, I got no idea what's going on here. But then he stopped, and he turned back around and looked at the actual door, like the actual front door of his apartment. And he began smelling the door, and the door definitely had the chemical smell. And so he began smelling and tracing his hands all over this door, not even sure what he was looking for, but eventually he worked his way all the way to the bottom of the door. And that's when he felt something. And so suddenly Umar got down and stared at the strange thing he had found on his door. And as soon as he saw what it was, he jumped up and ran to his wife to tell her what he had just found. After talking with his wife about this thing, they came up with a plan. Late that night, Umar waited until the entire apartment complex seemed really quiet, and then as quietly as he could, he opened up that front door, he stepped out into the hallway, and then he made his way over to the big fake plant that stood at the end of this hallway that was kind of right outside, kind of adjacent to his door, and he hid something in the plant, and then Umar went back into his apartment and he shut the door. And on June 27th, so 2 days later, the moment Umar and Samira had been waiting for finally arrived. At around 5:30 p.m. that evening, suddenly that chemical smell began to emanate through the apartment, and their baby began coughing so badly she began vomiting. And so as Samira was tending to their baby, Umar very quietly opened up his front door, looked in the hallway, didn't see anyone, and he rushed over to that plant, and he took the thing he had hidden a couple of days before, and he went back into his apartment, shut the door, and went into his office. And when Umar came out of that office a little while later, Samira was waiting and she was looking at him, and as Umar came out, it was like he was totally ashen-faced, he looked completely shocked, and he could barely speak. And Samira said, "What's going on? What did you learn?" And Umar said, "We have to get out of here right now. Get the baby. We have to leave right now. We're going to the hospital." And so as Samira bundled up their baby and they started getting their things together, Umar called 911 and told the operator what he had just discovered. The strange thing Umar had discovered on his front door 2 days earlier on June 25th was a weird crack at the very base of his door where you could basically see from inside of his apartment out into the hallway. And the thing Umar and his wife had decided to hide in the hallway in that plant was a video camera aimed at their front door, because they were suspicious that something was making its way through that crack in the door into their apartment, and they wanted to catch it on camera. And that's exactly what happened 2 days later, when around 5:30 p.m., their daughter began coughing, and Umar began to smell that smell in the apartment, and he rushed out, he got his camera, he went back into his office, he watched the footage, and he could not believe what his camera had recorded. Just before 5:30 p.m. on June 25th, so right before the smell came into the apartment, on video, you see this guy walk up the stairs and enter the hallway right in front of Umar and Samira's apartment door. And this man had a syringe in his hand, and he knelt down and he placed the syringe into that crack at the bottom of Umar and Samira's door, and he pushed the plunger of the syringe before pulling the syringe out, quickly turning and disappearing down the stairs. And so as Umar and Samira and their baby rushed to the hospital after discovering this video and after calling 911 to tell police what they saw on this video, the police rushed to Umar and Samira's apartment complex. Not to go to Umar and Samira's apartment though, instead to go to the apartment right below Umar and Samira. The man who rented that apartment right below them was a 36-year-old named Zuming Lee. He was a married father of two who was working on his PhD in chemistry from the University of South Florida, and Umar and Samira thought of him as being a really nice guy. He was very quiet, he kept to himself, he even gave them a gift after their daughter was born. But on this evening, when the police arrived at Zuming's apartment and knocked on the door, when Zuming opened it up, he was immediately arrested. It would turn out, despite Zuming giving Umar and Samira that gift after their baby was born, well, that was the end of him liking Umar and Samira. Because as soon as they came home with their baby, Zuming became obsessed with how noisy their baby was. Even if their baby was barely being loud, it completely consumed Zuming's mind. It was like he was obsessed with listening for this baby. And then suddenly it wasn't just the baby that annoyed him, it was even the slightest noise he heard above him coming from Umar and Samira's apartment that totally sent him into a rage. And so Zuming began constantly going to the homeowners association to complain about the baby and, the toilet sounds and the footsteps he was hearing. And when that wasn't enough, he began going to the police about it. Now, Umar and Samira had been told that their downstairs neighbor really was upset with how loud they were being, and so they did everything they could to be quiet. They felt so bad that they were coming off as being these very loud and disrespectful people, which they were not. They did have a little baby, and babies make noise, but they were doing everything they could to be quiet. And so they had no idea that Zuming was still just completely furious at them. And eventually, Zuming's fury just became completely unhinged, and he used his chemistry know-how, because remember, he's studying for his PhD in chemistry, to begin putting together this deadly mixture of chemicals that contain things like methadone and hydrocodone, and he put them into a syringe, and he began injecting them into Umar and Samira's apartment to poison them to make them be quiet. And so by the time Zuming was arrested, he had been injecting these deadly chemicals into their apartment for a month. That was obviously the cause of all of Umar and Samira and their baby's symptoms. It was this poison. Umar, Samira, and their baby would get treatment and they would fully recover from their poisoning. But very likely, had they not been quick thinkers and put that camera in place and caught Zuming in the act, it's entirely possible that over time, the poison that was being injected into their apartment would have killed them. Officials are still investigating this case as it's still relatively new. However, the legal process was paused when Zuming was deported back to China. Zuming has not been convicted of any crime, and the criminal case remains open, and if Zuming ever were to step foot on US soil, he would be arrested immediately. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the Mr. Ballen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.